Hello everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for this first Winter Warmers event, our partnership event here at the London Archives. We have another two. This is our first of this programme. And I'd particularly like to thank Tom and his team for hosting us. And today we are delighted to be joined by Dr Cindy Sughrue of the Dickens Museum, who's going to be talking to us about Dickens's connections with Clerkenwell, and our very special guest, Ian Dickens, Charles Dickens's great-great-grandson. So thank you both very much for coming today.
Pleasure, thank you. So thank you so much for that. And as Claire said, I'm the director of the Charles Dickens Museum, which is just a stone's throw from here. I hope you've all visited, and if not, that you will do.
Why not?
Sometime soon. Yeah, if not, why not? Quite. So 2025 is also a very special year for us because we will be celebrating our centenary. The museum opened in 1925, and we're currently putting the finishing touches on a new special exhibition called Dickens and Doughty Street, 100 Years of the Charles Dickens Museum. And that's going to open on the 5th of February and run until the end of June. And we've got various other centenary events and celebrations happening, so do look out for those. And I'm also thrilled that Ian could be here today. He lives on the Isle of Wight now, so it was a bit of a journey to get here. And I don't know if you'd like to just say a few words about yourself, Ian.
Sure. It's lovely to be here. Interestingly, I was educated in Tunbridge Wells, where I grew up, at a school called Huntleys, and we're in the Huntleys room. Quite extraordinary. Cindy was just talking about anniversaries this year. On the Isle of Wight last year, 2024, was the 175th anniversary of the Dickens family spending 3 months of their summer. They came in July and left in October, staying in Bonchurch on the Isle of Wight, where Dickens was starting to write David Copperfield for the first time. So there's lots of links to the island. And for 21 years, when I was marketing director for Olympus Cameras, we were based just the other side of Goswell Street. So this is very familiar old stomping grounds, mainly pubs and restaurants. But lovely to be here.
And that's where we'll be heading later. So thank you so much. Just going to get the next slide up here. So Charles Dickens. Everyone knows Charles Dickens, of course. He was the most popular writer of the Victorian period and remains one of the most celebrated writers of all time. He created some of English literature's most memorable characters, and his novels have never been out of print. But Dickens was much more than just a literary genius. He was a pioneering investigative journalist, a really tireless social reform campaigner. He was quite radical in that way. He was an advocate of scientific and engineering advances. He was a new adopter of new technology, an early adopter of new technology. He was also an accomplished actor. He was an international traveller and one of the greatest chroniclers of the Victorian period. And of course, today, Dickens is still internationally celebrated, locally loved, and is one of the most frequently cited reasons why people visit this glorious city of London. And just a short walk from here, as I mentioned, is the Charles Dickens Museum, in the heart of the sort of quintessential London landscape that Dickens writes so much about. The museum is formed of 2 terraced houses in Doughty Street, numbers 48 and 49. Number 48 is the only house in which Dickens lived in London that survives today. And within those buildings, we hold the world's largest collection of material relating to his life and work, over 100,000 items, and it spans the earliest portrait of him as a teenager through to the very last portrait of him on his deathbed, and indeed his legacy. So we still collect things about Dickens today. So Dickens and his wife Catherine moved into 48 Doughty Street in March of 1837. He was 25 and she was 21, and they were celebrating their first wedding anniversary. And this is what Dickens and Catherine looked like then. No one ever recognises Charles Dickens as a young man because they're used to the straggly beard and the dishevelled hair. But this is what he looked like at age 25. And when they moved in, their first child, Charles Dickens Jr., Charlie, was just a matter of weeks old. They would eventually have 10 children altogether. And Dickens took a 3-year lease on number 48 Doughty Street. He described it to a friend in a letter as taking on an awesome responsibility. And even though he was only there for 3 years, what a 3 years it was. He was in the middle of writing Pickwick Paper when they moved in, so finished Pickwick Papers, wrote Oliver Twist. Nicholas Nickleby started work on Barnaby Rudge, continued to write as a journalist, and I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment, and also writing short stories. He edited the memoirs of Joseph Grimaldi, the very famous Victorian clown, who died just a few months after they moved in. So he was incredibly busy during all that time. 2 more children arrived in those 3 years, and the household expanded with relatives and servants. They outgrew Doughty Street and moved to a bigger house up near Regent's Park. As I mentioned, the museum was founded in 1925, which was 55 years after Dickens's death in 1870, and it was there to promote the life and particularly the legacy of Dickens. And today, of course, 100 years on, we're still doing that. We offer permanent displays as well as temporary exhibitions, special events that explore many facets of Dickens, his life and work, and particularly why his work still matters today. But also, let's not get lost in superlatives. Dickens was a complex, flawed individual, aren't we all? And we don't shy away from, exploring some of those more difficult aspects of Dickens as we continue to explore his lasting impact. Now, on to Clerkenwell, my good creatures, as we've promised. So this is a more modern map, not a particularly great one, but the area we're talking about is bordered by Pentonville Road to the north, the area around Farringdon Road to the west, Goswell Road to the east, that Dickens mentioned, and Smithfield to the south. And I think I did slot it in. Yes. Now this is a fabulous 1746 map by John Rock, courtesy of Matt Brown, who runs the Londonist. He's been painstakingly colouring in. It's glorious. So this gives you the area we're talking about in full. And this one here, we are somewhere around here. Where we are just now, so I'll give you a bit of a close-up there. So Clerkenwell formed part of the major thoroughfare into the city from the north, and Dickens knew it well. He moved here with his family when he was 10 years old, and their first home was in Camden Town, so he was regularly, daily, walking through this area. It was a very lively, dynamic place at the time, so it's perhaps not surprising that there is some connection with Clerkenwell in all of Dickens's novels, except for one. And if anyone knows the one, I'll give you a prize afterwards. A number of characters lived here. They conducted businesses, they travelled through it, and it's the setting for some crucial scenes in Dickens's earlier novels, particularly when he was living in nearby Doughty Street. And although Clerkenwell isn't mentioned directly in Dickens's famous tale, A Christmas Carol, there is no doubt that Bob Cratchit would have passed through it on his way to work from Bob Cratchit's fictional home in Camden Town, which was very much based on Dickens's childhood home, to Scrooge's counting house just off Cornhill in the city. But in Dickens's very first novel, Pickwick Papers, Mr. Pickwick himself resides in Clerkenwell on Goswell Street, which of course is now Goswell Road, but it was called Street at the time. And this is a wonderful artwork from our collection. Almost everything you're seeing here today is from the museum's collection. And this is Pickwick addressing the Pickwick Club. And after a brief introductory chapter, we get into the meat of the novel in a chapter that's called The First Day's Journey and the First Evening's Adventures with Their Consequences. And this is how it begins.
Before I start, I should just pick up on the Pickwick Club. There are several Pickwick clubs in the UK. The oldest is the Pickwick Bicycle Club, formed in 1870, a couple of months after Charles Dickens died. And my uncle, Cedric, who was more like Mr. Pickwick than Mr. Pickwick himself, created the Dickens Pickwick Club, of which I am the chair. And it's wonderful that we have two of our members here, Brian and John, wearing their club tie. If they don't have their club tie, they'll be fined a bottle of port. So well done, gentlemen. So this is lovely that we're starting off with Pickwick. That punctual servant of all work, the sun, had just risen and begun to strike a light on the morning of the 13th of May, 1827, when Mr. Samuel Pickwick burst like another sun from his slumbers, threw open his chamber window, and looked out upon the world beneath. Goswell Street was at his feet. Goswell Street was on his right hand as far as... Oops, sorry. Lord, sorry. That's good. You can go now.
See everything. there we go.
Sorry, I won't lean that there. Goswell Street, let's see, Goswell Street was on his right hand, as far as the eye could reach. Goswell Street extended on his left, and the opposite side of Goswell Street was over the way. Such, thought Mr. Pickwick, are the narrow views of those philosophers who, content with examining the things that lie before them, look not to the truths which are hidden beyond. As well might I be content to gaze on Goswell Street forever, without one effort to penetrate to the hidden countries which on every side surround it. And having given vent to this beautiful reflection, Mr. Pickwick proceeded to put himself into his clothes, and his clothes into his portmanteau. Great men are seldom over-scrupulous in the arrangement of their attire. The operation of shaving, dressing, and coffee imbibing was soon performed, and in another hour, Mr. Pickwick, with his portmanteau in his hand, his telescope in his greatcoat pocket, and his notebook in his waistcoat, ready for the reception of any discoveries worthy of being noted down, had arrived at the coach stand in St. Mary le Grand.
So Mr. Pickwick returns to his lodgings in Goswell Street in chapter 12, so 10 chapters later, after the first of his adventures out in the countryside and towns of Kent. And this is how his return is described.
Mr. Pickwick's apartment in Goswell Street, although on a limited scale, was not only of a very neat and comfortable description, but peculiarly adapted for the residence of a man of his genius and observation. His sitting room was the first floor front, his bedroom the second floor front, and thus, whether he was sitting at his desk in his parlour or standing before the dressing glass in his dormitory, he had an equal opportunity of contemplating human nature in all the numerous phases it exhibits in that not more populous than popular thoroughfare. His landlady, Mrs. Bardell, the relict and sole executrix of a deceased custom house officer, was a comely woman of bustling manners and agreeable appearance, with a natural genius for cooking, improved by study and long practice into an exquisite talent.
Thank you. So Pickwick Papers was serialised, as almost all of Dickens's fictional writing was, serialised in 20 monthly instalments between March 1836 to November 1837. And it became so popular, it really catapulted Dickens to international fame like a skyrocket, as one early reviewer put it. And to give you an idea of the scale of this success, the publishers, Chapman and Hall, initially envisaged the sale of about 500 copies a month, which was good going for serialized fiction at the time. The first installment sold around 400 copies, not bad for an unknown author. By halfway through the serialization, it was up to 14,000 a month. And by the end, the monthly sales reached 40,000. So going from expected 500 to 40,000 a month. So it was phenomenal. There's no doubt about it. It was nothing short of a sensation here in the UK, but also in America, other parts of the English-speaking world, and in Europe. Pickwick was one of the first of what became many of Dickens's titles to be translated into other languages. We know, in fact, that during Dickens's lifetime, before 1870, there were some of his works translated into at least 18 different languages, including more unusual ones like Icelandic and Croatian. So he was this worldwide phenomenon, quite extraordinary. So I'll show you this before we move on. This slide here it's a piece called Mr. Dickens Meets Mr. Pickwick in Doughty Street. So this was created in 1925 when the museum opened by an artist called Charles Buckle. So that is number 48 Doughty Street. And you'll notice that there's one of those little blue plaques at the top. Well, we know them as blue plaques today. The Dickens Fellowship, which founded the museum, the Dickens Fellowship was formed in 1902, and one of its first acts was to petition the local authority to put a plaque up. And that first plaque appeared in 1903. So quite extraordinary. It was on the building before the museum even acquired the building in 1925. So quite extraordinary. So, in contrast to the very light-hearted frivolity of Mr. Pickwick and his friends, Dickens' second novel, which he began to write and serialise at the same time as Pickwick was going out, so they overlapped for quite some months, this was radically different. It delved into the real gritty aspects of early Victorian society. It exposed contemporary social issues, explored the criminal underworld, and brought the realities of the poorest in London to wide public awareness. And this, of course, was Oliver Twist. And the themes there in Oliver Twist are themes that resonated deeply with Dickens himself, from his own childhood experience, as well as his very close observation of the lives and conditions of people all around him in London. So even though he lived in a posh street, in Doughty Street, he was surrounded by some of the darkest, most dubious neighbourhoods in all of London at the time. So, having established himself as one to watch with Pickwick, Dickens turned now to writing about these pressing issues of the day. And even though we might know Oliver as particularly a musical, excellent new musical, but also, we all know Oliver from different adaptations. But Dickens was writing this to draw attention to what were the new poor laws and the impact that those laws were having on ordinary people and the cruelty of the workhouse system. And this was radical stuff. As was putting a child at the centre of the novel. So Dickens was the first one that made the child the centre. So this was really pioneering stuff. So it begins with Oliver's birth in the workhouse, illegitimate child, somewhere in the Midlands in the 1830s. It's set at the time that Dickens was writing it, so it was very much a contemporary novel. And Oliver's mother is found on the street, brought into the workhouse, and gives birth to Oliver and dies shortly thereafterwards. So Oliver spends the first 9 years of his life in a very badly run home for orphans, and then at the age of 9 he's transferred to the workhouse. And I'll have Ian read perhaps one of the more obvious sections of it in a moment. But as you'll know, please, sir, I want some more. We could probably do it in chorus. So one of the most famous lines from Oliver, and this is him getting, I suppose, his way out of the workhouse by asking for more. Mr. Bumble, the beadle, decides he's had enough of Oliver Twist. He offers anyone £5 to take the boy off his hands. Oliver ends up with a local undertaker, Mr. Sowerby. And when the undertaker's other apprentice gives him a bit of a hard time about who his mother was, so, comments about his mother, Oliver attacks him, runs out, and heads off to London. So after little Oliver's been walking for about a week, he arrives in Barnet, which of course north of London at the time, part of London now. And that's where he meets Jack Dawkins, also known, of course, as the Artful Dodger. And this is how Dickens describes him.
He was about his own age, but one of the queerest looking boys that Oliver had ever seen. He had about him all the airs and manners of a man. He was short for his age, with rather bow legs and little sharp eyes. His hat was stuck on the top of his head so lightly that it threatened to fall off every moment, and would have done so very often if the wearer had not a knack of every now and then giving his head a sudden twitch which brought it back to its old place again. He wore a man's coat which reached nearly to his heels. He had turned the cuffs back halfway up his arms to get his hands out of the sleeves, apparently with the ultimate view of thrusting them into the pockets of his corduroy trousers, for there he kept them. He was altogether as roistering and swaggering a young gentleman as ever stood 4'6" or something less.
And this next slide is another artist's interpretation of the Artful Dodger. This is by Frank Reynolds after Dickens's death. And so Jack offers Oliver shelter in the London home of his so-called benefactor, Mr. Fagin, and off they head to London.
As Dawkins objected to their entering London before nightfall, it was nearly 11 o'clock when they reached the turnpike at Islington. They crossed from the Angel into St John's Road, struck down the small street which terminates at Sadler's Wells Theatre, through Exmouth Street and Coppice Row, down the little court by the side of the workhouse, across the classic ground which once bore the name of Hockley in the Hole, thence to Little Saffron Hill, and so on to Saffron Hill the Great, along which the Dodger scudded at a rapid pace, directing Oliver to follow close at his heels. Although Oliver had enough to occupy his attention in keeping sight of his leader, he could not help bestowing a few hasty glances on either side of the way as he passed along. A dirtier or more wretched place he had never seen. The streets were very narrow and muddy, and the air was impregnated with filthy odours. There were a good many small shops, but the only stock in trade appeared to be heaps of children, who even at that time of night were crawling in and out at the doors or screaming from the inside. The sole places that seemed to prosper amid the general blight of the place were the public houses, and in them the lowest orders of Irish were wrangling with might and main. Covered ways and yards, which here and there diverged from the main street, disclosed little knots of houses, where drunken men and women were positively wallowing in filth, and from several of the doorways great ill-looking fellows were cautiously emerging, bound to all appearance on no very well-disposed or harmless errands. Oliver was just considering whether he hadn't better run away when they reached the bottom of the hill. His conductor, catching him by the arm, pushed open the door of a house near Field Lane and, drawing him into the passage, closed it behind him.
It turns out, of course, that Fagin is a career criminal, and he trains orphan boys to pick pockets for him. So after a few days of training, Oliver is sent on a mission with two of the other boys. It has to be said, Oliver hasn't realised they're pickpockets yet. And this is from chapter 10.
The three boys sallied out. The Dodger, with his coat sleeves tucked up and his hat cocked as usual. Master Bates sauntering along with his hands in his pockets, and Oliver between them, wondering where they were going and what branch of manufacture he would be so instructed in first. The pace at which they went was such a very lazy, ill-looking saunter that Oliver soon began to think his companions were going to deceive the old gentleman by not going to work at all. The Dodger had a vicious propensity, too, of pulling the caps from the heads of small boys and tossing them down areas, while Charlie Bates exhibited some very loose notions concerning the rights of property by pilfering divers apples and onions from the stalls at the kennel sides and thrusting them into pockets which were so surprisingly capacious that they seemed to undermine his whole suit of clothes in every direction. These things looked so bad that Oliver was on the point of declaring his intention of seeking his way back as best he could, when his thoughts were suddenly directed into another channel by a very mysterious change of behaviour on the part of the Dodger. They were just emerging from a narrow court not far from the open square in Clerkenwell, which is yet called by some strange perversion of terms the Green, when the Dodger was made a sudden stop and, laying his finger on his lips, drew his companions back again with the greatest caution and circumspection. "What's the matter?" demanded Oliver. "Hush," replied the Dodger. "Do you see that old cove at the bookstall?" "The old gentleman over the way?" said Oliver. "Yes, I see him." "He'll do," said the Dodger. "A prime plant," observed Mr. Charlie Bates. Oliver looked from one to the other with the greatest surprise, but he was not permitted to make any inquiries, for the two boys walked stealthily across the road and slunk close behind the old gentleman, towards whom his attention had been directed. Oliver walked a few paces after them, and not knowing whether to advance or retire, stood looking on in silent amazement. The old gentleman was a very respectable-looking personage, with a powdered head and gold spectacles. He was dressed in a blue-green coat with a black velvet collar, wore white trousers, and carried a smart bamboo cane under his arm. He had taken up a book from the stall, and there he stood, reading away as hard as if he were in his elbow chair in his own study. It's very possible that he fancied himself there indeed, for it was plain from his abstraction that he saw not the bookstall, nor the street, nor the boys, nor, in short, anything but the book itself, which he was reading straight through, turning over the leaf when he got to the bottom of a page, beginning at the top line of the next one, and going regularly on with the greatest interest and eagerness. What was Oliver's horror and alarm as he stood a few paces off, looking on with his eyelids as wide open as they would possibly go, to see the Dodger plunge his hand into the old gentleman's pocket and draw from thence a handkerchief, to see him hand the same to Charlie Bates, and finally to behold them both running away round the corner at full speed. In the instant, the whole mystery of the handkerchiefs and the watches and the jewels and Fagin rushed upon the boy's mind. He stood for a moment with the blood so tingling through all his veins from terror that he felt as if he were in a burning fire. Then, confused and frightened, he took to his heels and, not knowing what he did, made off as fast as he could lay his feet on the ground. This was all done in a minute's space. In the very instant when Oliver began to run, the old gentleman, putting his hand to his pocket and missing the handkerchief, turned sharp around. Seeing the boy scudding away at such a rapid pace, he very naturally concluded him to be the depredator, and shouting, "Stop, thief!" with all his might, made off after him, book in hand. But the old gentleman wasn't the only person who raised the hue and cry. The Dodger and Master Bates, unwilling to attract public attention by running down the open street, had merely retired into the very first doorway around the corner. They no sooner heard the cry and saw Oliver running than, guessing exactly how the matter stood, they issued forth with great promptitude and shouting, "Stop, thief!" too, joined in the pursuit like good citizens. Although Oliver had been brought up by philosophers, he was not theoretically acquainted with the beautiful axiom that self-preservation is the first law of nature. If he had been, perhaps he would have been prepared for this. Not being prepared, however, it alarmed him the more. So away he went like the wind, with the old gentleman and the two boys roaring and shouting behind him, "Stop, thief! Stop, thief!" There is a magic in the sound. The tradesman leaves his counter and the carman his wagon. The butcher throws down his tray, the baker his basket, the milkman his pail, the errand boy his parcels, the schoolboy his marbles, the pavior his pickaxe, the child his battledore. Away they run, pell-mell, helter-skelter, slapdash, tearing, yelling, screaming, knocking down the passengers as they turn the corners, rousing up the dogs and astonishing the fowls, and streets, squares and courts re-echo with the sound. "Stop, thief! Stop, thief!" The cry is taken up by 100 voices, and the crowd accumulate at every turn. Away they fly, splashing through the mud and rattling along the pavements. Up go the windows, outrun the people, onward bear the mob. A whole audience desert Punch in the very thickest of the plot, and joining the rushing throng, swell the shout and lend fresh vigour to the cry, "Stop, thief! Stop, thief!"
Fantastic, thank you. So nearly 20 chapters of Oliver Twist take place in this area of Clerkenwell, with scenes set on Saffron Hill, Clerkenwell Green, Smithfield, and many of the landmarks that he writes about are still there today, very much visible in the neighbourhood. And this includes one that you might know, the 1 Ton, which was known in the novel as the Three Cripples. So that building is still there, just on the lower part of Saffron Hill. So Oliver Twist was serialised in, let's go back there, in monthly instalments, like all of the other books, and that was over 2 years, from early 1837 through to April 1839. And it's been referred to as the first Victorian novel because serialisation started just 3 or 4 months before Queen Victoria ascended to the throne. So it has been dubbed that title. And it was very much a contemporary novel. There were gangs of pickpockets operating in this area. Dickens was a contemporary writer. He wasn't writing about things that were fiction. He was writing about real street-level crime and street-level issues. And Queen Victoria read it when it was eventually published in volume form in 1839. She was 20 years old and became at that point a lifelong admirer of Dickens. And here is Queen Victoria's actual copy. So this is from the Royal Collections Trust. She described Oliver Twist in her journal, so that these descriptions survive as well. She said it was excessively interesting, beautifully and cleverly written. Now, the Prime Minister at the time, Lord Melbourne, had tried to sort of protect Victoria from the harsh realities of British life and advised her very strongly not to read Oliver Twist because it dealt with what he described as paupers, criminals, and other unpleasant subjects. But in her diary, Queen Victoria quotes Lord Melbourne as saying, he says, "It's all among workhouses and coffin makers and pickpockets. He says, I don't like these things. I wish to avoid them. I don't like them in reality, and therefore I don't want them represented." So in other words, if I, the Prime Minister, don't have to look at them, I don't have to acknowledge them, I don't have to deal with these social issues. But the reality of contemporary life, especially amongst the poor, was what really ignited Dickens's imagination, both as a novelist and as a social reform campaigner, as I mentioned earlier. And when I say campaign, he did this in a number of ways. He wrote letters to the press, to politicians. He wrote newspaper articles, political pamphlets that he distributed at meetings. He signed petitions. He did all of that. But he also stitched his views into his novels. And so at the end of the passage that Ian just read, Oliver is apprehended and he's taken to the local magistrate in Hatton Garden. And at the time Dickens was writing, there was a notoriously harsh magistrate in Hatton Garden called Alan Stuart Lang. He worked there from 1836 to 38. So Oliver Twist is 37 to 39. And Dickens knew Lang by reputation because he was notoriously cruel and harsh, and he thought he's a good model for my magistrate. So we have a letter in the museum's collection that Dickens wrote to an acquaintance who was the court reporter at the magistrate's office. And it's dated the 3rd of June, 1837. And do I have a copy of it here? Yes, I do. You won't be able to read this, so Ian is going to read a bit of it for you.
Thank you. In my next number of Oliver Twist, I must have a magistrate, and casting about for a magistrate whose harshness and insolence would render him a fit subject to be shown up, I have, as a necessary consequence, stumbled upon Mr. Lane of Hatton Garden, celebrity. I know the man's character perfectly well, but as it would be necessary to describe his appearance also, I ought to have seen him, which, fortunately or unfortunately, as the case may be, I have never done. In this dilemma, it occurred to me that perhaps I might, under your auspices, be smuggled into the Hatton Garden office for a few moments some morning. If you can further my object, I shall be really very gratefully obliged to you.
So that's interesting. Dickens wanted to show him up, to call out this real magistrate. So the real Mr. Lang becomes the fictional Mr. Fang. I love that. So it's very thinly disguised. Lang was eventually removed from the office because of his unreasonable sentences, and Dickens was part of that. So we today read Mr. Fang, we don't realise, but he was making a point and trying to make a difference. So doing that through his campaigning, but also through his fiction, through his writing. So Oliver Twist, probably the most well-known of Dickens's novels, perhaps second to the Christmas book, we all know. So now we're going to turn to the least well-known of Dickens's novel, and it is Barnaby Rudge. Now, a quick poll in the room. Has anyone ever read it? Well, oh, good. Has anyone heard of it? A few more. Okay. So I'm going to hopefully encourage and inspire you all to read it. It's the least well-known and a little bit maligned of his novels. I think there's a lot of merit in it. So Clerkenwell features more in Barnaby Rudge than it does in Oliver Twist. It's also, Barnaby Rudge, the most London-y of Dickens's novels, with 105 London locations. So if you're really interested in London, that's the novel to read. It's one of only 2 novels that Dickens wrote that are deliberately set in the past. One is A Tale of Two Cities, you're probably familiar with, but Barnaby Rudge is set in 1780, the year of the Gordon riots, and that's the subject of it. It was serialized in weekly installments in 1841, so set 60 years earlier than when it was being written about. And as I say, it centers on the Gordon riots. One of the heroes of the novel is a man called Gabriel Varden. He's a Clerkenwell locksmith, and his daughter Dolly. And the story is it's a vehicle for describing the Gordon riots, but at the centre of this is Gabriel, his daughter Dolly, and two young men, Edward Chester and Joe Willets. And these young men are thwarted both in romance and other things, but also they're feeling a bit rebellious toward their unsympathetic fathers. The Gordon riots were the anti-Catholic riots sparked by Lord George Gordon, who opposed the Catholic Relief Act of 1778. So 2 years earlier, the act had been passed. And that lifted many of the civil rights restrictions on Catholics that had been imposed by the Popery Act some 80 years before that. So on the 2nd of June, 1780, a crowd of about 50,000 people gathered outside the Houses of Parliament to present a petition. It got very rowdy. The soldiers managed to disperse the crowd at the time. A few arrests were made, but that was just the beginning. So over the next 5 days, the protest escalated into the most destructive riots in London's history. Protesters attacked all sorts of public and private buildings, including Newgate Prison, which was destroyed through the process, the Bank of England, and many lives were lost. It's estimated somewhere between 300 and 700 lives were lost. So we have another image here of Barnaby, the main character, or the character of the title. I've already said that Dickens did something quite radical in Oliver Twist by placing a child at the centre of the novel. And children or childlike people feature in many of his other works. So the eponymous Barnaby Rudge has a learning disability, and from how Dickens describes him, it's really clear that Dickens knew someone personally who has something called Williams syndrome. So it's a genetic disorder that's characterized by very distinct elfin-like features, some cognitive delays in terms of learning ability, and often in some cases potential cardiovascular problems. So people with Williams syndrome also have very striking verbal abilities, excellent advanced vocabulary, highly sociable personalities, and an affinity for music. So all of these characteristics come out in how Dickens describes Barnaby. And he draws a very sympathetic portrayal of him. He's a 27-year-old man still living with his widowed mother, and he's duped into engaging with the riot's ringleaders. So we see the rioting from a very different perspective. And although the novel itself met with a somewhat mixed reception at the time, it inspired a phenomenal number of stage adaptations. And Dolly Varden herself, this is one of the most famous portraits of her. It's by William Powell Frith, and it's in the V&A collection. She became a hugely popular figure. She inspired songs, dances, artworks like this, and fashion. There's something called the Dolly Varden look became a craze. Some years later, in the 1870s, those were the years after Dickens's death. So that was a version of fashions of the previous centuries. And I think here I've got, so a couple of examples in our collection of sheet music. So we've got the Dolly Varden polka, and what's the other one? Quadrilles, maybe. I can't see without my spectacles on. So it was, no one's heard of Dolly Varden now, but she was such a popular figure that she inspired a name for a hat. You can see the hat worn in some of these illustrations. Also a type of printed calico fabric, which was very popular in terms of how she was presented, and also a species of trout. So there you go. So we meet Dolly in Clerkenwell in chapter 4.
In the venerable suburb, it was a suburb once, of Clerkenwell, towards that part of its confines which is nearest to the Charterhouse, and in one of those cool, shady streets, of which a few widely scattered and dispersed yet remain in such old parts of the metropolis, each tenement quietly vegetating like an ancient citizen who long ago retired from business and dozing on in its infirmity until, in course of time, it tumbles down and is replaced by some extravagant young heir flaunting in stucco and ornamental work and all the vanities of the modern days. In this quarter, and in a street of this description, the business of the present chapter lies. At the time of which it treats, though only 66 years ago, a very large part of what is London now had no existence. Even in the brains of the wildest speculators, there had sprung up no long rows of streets connecting Highgate with Whitechapel, no assemblages of palaces on the swampy levels, nor little cities in the open fields. Although this part of town was then, and now, parcelled out in streets and plentifully peopled, it wore a different aspect. There were gardens to many of the houses and trees by the pavement side with an air of freshness breathing up and down, which in these days would be sought in vain. Fields were nigh at hand, through which the New River took its winding course, and where there were merry haymaking in the summertime. Nature was not so far removed or hard to get at as in these days, and although there were busy trades in Clerkenwell, and working jewellers by the scores, it was a purer place, with the farmhouses near to it than many modern Londoners would readily believe, and lovers' walks at no great distance, which turned into squalid courts long before the lovers of this age were born, or, as the phrase goes, thought of. In one of those streets, the cleanest of them all, and on the shady side of the way, for good housewives know that sunlight damages their cherished furniture and so choose the shade rather than its intrusive glare, there stood the house with which we have to deal. It was a modest building, not very straight, not large, not tall, not bold-faced with great staring windows, but a shy, blinking house with a conical roof going up into a peak over its garret windows of 4 small panes of glass, like a cocked hat on the head of an elderly gentleman with one eye. It was not built of brick or lofty stone, but of wood and plaster. It was not planned with a dull and wearisome regard to regularity, for no one window matched the other. All seemed to have the slightest reference to anything besides itself. The shop, for it had a shop, was, with reference to the first floor, where shops usually are, and there are all resemblances between it and any other shop, stopped short and ceased. People who went in and out didn't go up a flight of steps to it or walk easily in upon a level with the street, but dived down 3 steep stairs as into a cellar. The floor was paved with stone and brick, as that of any other cellar might be, and in lieu of window frame and glazed, it had a great black wooden flap, or shutter, nearly breast-high from the ground, which turned back in the daytime, admitting as much cold air as light, and very often more. Behind this shop was a wainscoted parlour, looking first into a paved yard, and beyond that again into a little terrace garden, raised some feet above it. Any stranger would have supposed that this wainscoted parlour, saving for the door of communication by which he had entered, was cut off and detached from all the world, and indeed most strangers on their first entrance were observed to grow extremely thoughtful, as weighing and pondering in their minds whether the upper rooms were only approachable by ladders from without, never suspecting that 2 of the most unassuming and unlikely doors in existence, which the most ingenious mechanism on earth must of necessity have supposed to be the doors of closets, opened out of this room, each without the smallest preparation, or so much as a quarter of an inch of passage, upon 2 dark winding flights of stairs, the one upward, the other downward, which were the sole means of communication between that chamber and the other portions of the house. With all these oddities, there was not a neater, more scrupulously tidy, or more punctiliously ordered house in Clerkenwell, in London, in all England. There were not cleaner windows, or whiter floors, or brighter stoves, or more highly shining articles of furniture in old mahogany. There was not more rubbing, scrubbing, burnishing, and polishing in the whole street put together, nor was this excellence attained without some cost and trouble, and great expenditure of voice, as the neighbours were frequently reminded when the good lady of the house overlooked and assisted in its being put to rights on cleaning days, which were usually from Monday morning until Sunday night, both days inclusive. Leaning against the doorpost of this, his dwelling, the locksmith stood early on the morning after which he had met with the wounded man, gazing disconsolately at a great wooden emblem of a key, painted in vivid yellow to resemble gold, which dangled from the house front and swung to and fro with a mournful creaking noise, as if complaining that it had nothing to unlock. Sometimes he looked over his shoulder into the shop, which was so dark and dingy with numerous tokens of his trade, and so blackened by the smoke from a little forge near which his prentice was at work, that it would have been difficult for one unused to such espials to have distinguished anything but various tools of uncouth make and shape, great bunches of rusty keys, fragments of iron, half-finished locks, and such like things which garnished the walls and hung in clusters from the ceiling.
Wonderful, thank you. So you've seen a bit of Dolly. There's Gabriel Varden, her father. And what a wonderful description of the home and workshop of this man. So other things that appear in Clerkenwell, the Clerkenwell New Prison, which was just around the corner from where we are right now, is a scene for some of the rioting. And there's a large detachment of soldiers that are stationed at New River Head the morning after the first lot of riots to prevent the rioters from cutting off the water supply, because, of course, London was ablaze from all of their destructive activity. So it's a good read. I encourage you all to pick it up, those who haven't done so already. Now we'll finish with something a bit more familiar, David Copperfield. So here we are, David Copperfield, 1850, Dickens's 8th novel, and it was serialised during 1849 through to 1850. It's the most autobiographical of Dickens's works. I mean, there's a bit of Dickens in everything he wrote, but it really does trace a lot of his life. So after a very happy early childhood, and following his mother's sudden, unexpected death, David is sent to London to work in his stepfather's wine warehouse, and he lodges with a family called the Micawbers, Wilkins and Emma Micawber and their children. And the Micawbers are very much modelled on Dickens's own parents. This is Charles Dickens's father, John, and Mrs. Micawber is perennially loyal, without fault, loyal to Mr. Micawber, and he is hopelessly ill-suited to managing anything, particularly money, and he frequently overextends himself and ends up in serious debt. Mr. Micawber is famously always waiting for something to turn up, and as I say, very much modelled on Dickens's own parents. So David gets to know the Micawbers when they are living with their young family in Windsor Terrace, just off City Road. In this illustration, you can possibly just make it out. It says Windsor Terrace. And Mr. Micawber ends up in a debtor's prison, as did Dickens's own father, with his own impoverished family forced to follow him into the prison, as indeed happened with Dickens himself. Micawber is a very volatile, melodramatic, tragic, comic figure. And a little later in the novel, after he's managed to get out of debt once again, David is visiting the Micawbers, living in accommodation in Pentonville, another home that is well beyond their means, and they're forced to abandon it. So after a visit one evening, Mr. Micawber, buoyant at that stage and expecting something imminently turning up, David is shocked to receive a letter, and here's how it goes.
My dear young friend, the die is cast. All is over. Hiding the ravages of care with a sickly mask of mirth, I have not informed you this evening that there is no hope of the remittance. Under these circumstances, alike humiliating to endure, humiliating to contemplate, and humiliating to relate, I have discharged the pecuniary liability contracted at this establishment by giving a note of hand made payable 14 days after date at my residence, Pentonville, London. When it becomes due, it will not be taken up. The result is destruction, the bolt is impending, the tree must fall. Like the wretched man who now addresses you, my dear Copperfield, be a beacon to you through life. He writes with that intention and in that hope. If he could think himself of so much use, one gleam of day might by possibility penetrate into the cheerless dungeon of his remaining existence through his longevity is at present, to say the least of it, extremely problematical. This is the last communication, my dear Copperfield, you will ever receive from the beggared outcast, Wilkins Micawber.
And of course, it's not the last communication he ever receives. This roller coaster of something's bound to turn up and then being plunged into debt and hopeless despair is a theme throughout the novel. And the Micawbers are back in this neighbourhood again, much later on, chapter 36, in lodgings just off Gray's Inn Road, from where Mr. Micawber again writes to David.
My dear Copperfield, you may possibly not be unprepared to receive the intimation that something has turned up. I may have mentioned to you on a former occasion that I was in expectation of such an event. I'm about to establish myself in one of the provincial towns of our favoured island, where the society may be described as a happy admixture of the agricultural and the clerical, in immediate connection with one of the learned professions. Mrs. Micawber and our offspring will accompany me. Our ashes at a future period will probably be found commingled in the cemetery attached to a venerable pile, for which the spot to which I refer has required a reputation, shall I say, from China to Peru. In addition, in bidding adieu to the modern Babylon, where we have undergone many vicissitudes, I trust not ignobly, Mrs. Micawber and myself cannot disguise from our minds that we part, it may be for years and it may be forever, with an individual linked by strong associations to the altar of our domestic life. If, on the eve of such a departure, you will accompany our mutual friend, Mr. Thomas Traddles, to our present abode, and there reciprocate the wishes natural to the occasion, you will confer a boon on one who is ever yours, Wilkins Micawber. I was glad to find that Mr. Micawber had got rid of his dust and ashes, and that something really had turned up at last.
There we go. So we come to the end of our trip through Clerkenwell with Charles Dickens, full of happiness, hope, despair, tragedy, salvation, danger, all these wonderful things. Sadly, we haven't had time today to walk out with Mr. Jarvis Lorry from his home here in Clerkenwell in A Tale of Two Cities, or we haven't had time to pop into Bleeding Heart Yard with Little Dorrit, nor have we had time to visit that peculiar workshop of Mr. Venus, that extraordinary taxidermist and articulator of bones in Our Mutual Friend, which was the very last novel that Dickens completed in 1865. We'll need to leave that journey for another day. Thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes if there are any questions or comments. Happy to take them. Yes, please.
Is there any documentation of a bookshop that would have existed in Clerkenwell Green at the time Dickens wrote?
So that's asking about if there's any documentation of that bookshop in Clerkenwell, any bookshop in Clerkenwell Green at the time that Dickens was writing Oliver Twist. The honest answer is I don't know. There certainly appears bookshops fairly regularly, and they were often almost pop-up stalls that stall keepers would keep, rather than a fixed accommodation.
I keep looking for plaques in case something has been sort of hidden away somewhere. But are there any plaques in Clerkenwell to identify certain spots that Dickens may have?
Plaques in Clerkenwell for Dickens? Well, I don't think there are any plaques as such. There's certainly some excellent walking tours that give you those locations.
Thank you.
Weren't they all serialised?
His books were all, his novels were all serialised in instalments.
Yes.
Most of them monthly. There was one, A Tale of Two Cities, was weekly, as was Barnaby Rudge. So a couple of them were weekly instalments. We all know A Christmas Carol, because that's quite a short novel, a novella really. That was published as a single volume, but all the others were serialised, and then immediately on conclusion of the serialisations, published as volumes.
And they were paid by the number of words, weren't they?
They were, yes. So you would try to get a certain number of words in each of those volumes, so that the cover price could be consistent.
In the serialisation, they were paid by the number of words.
Yes.
in school, so I just wanted to get that out.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, Dickens did. They had to have, like most magazines, you're paying a certain standard cover price each month or each week, and you want to make sure you're getting the same amount of material. So Dickens did have to work roughly to a certain number of words per issue.
And just like a script writer in a soap opera, he would always try to finish it on a cliffhanger. So you had to come back the next month to buy the next issue to see what happened next.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
There's a question from home, from Joanne, which is, do you know where Charles Dickens kept his horse or carriage?
Well, when he was, he kept them in various places depending where he was living. But when he was living in Doughty Street, we know that he kept a horse and trap around the corner in Doughty Mews. They had 4 servants by the time they left Doughty Street. One of those was a manservant who looked after the horse, ran errands, took messages for Dickens, and he lived in the mews above where the horse was stabled. And at each of his subsequent London locations, he would have a horse stabled nearby, usually in the mews adjacent to where he was living.
And of course, Dickens was an inveterate walker with this mind with constant plots and characters and twists. He'd ignore the horse completely and would walk from London all the way to Gad's Hill in Kent, which was about 27 miles, walking through the night at a fair pace.
Yes, sir.
Was it Edwin Drood that had no mention of Clerkenwell in it?
No, it didn't actually. So all of the novels have a passing reference to it, including Edwin Drood. Yes, and our mutual friend, which I mentioned just at the end there, was the last novel that Dickens completed, because of course he died when he was only part way through Edwin Drood. So we don't know if Clerkenwell might have been his mind for a sort of appearance later on, but certainly one of the characters passes through this area.
So which novel didn't have a mention of Clerkenwell?
Okay. Any ideas? Anyone know? It's Hard Times. Hard Times. It's set entirely in the north, in the fictional industrial town of Coketown, which I think is probably modelled on Preston. So it's the only one where it doesn't feature. Yes, Tom.
A follow-up question. Do you happen to know which number in Doughty Mews? Because our questioner used to live at number 24.
Oh, right. Oh, gosh, I'm afraid I don't know.
Yeah.
But if he wants to email info@dickensmuseum.com and say it's a question for Cindy, I will do my best. Yes, I will do my best to find that out. You're very welcome.
So what is the Pickwick Club?
The Pickwick Club. So,
what's the aim?
So in the novel, it was a group of friends who decided they would form a club to go off and investigate things. So they were there to travel and discover and investigate and just have a jolly good time.
Yes.
But we found, and there's an extraordinary item in our collection, which is a minute book from a real Pickwick club that formed while Dickens was still writing Pickwick Papers. Because it was this phenomenon, so people started their own clubs. So the minute book we have was a group of young men living in the east of London that would gather to debate current affairs of the day, matters of the heart. It's an extraordinary social history document. But we know there were a number of these popping up all over the UK, but also in America. The writer Longfellow was a member of a Pickwick Club, and if anyone knows the writer Louisa May Alcott and her most famous book Little Women, the March sisters formed their own Pickwick Club. It's extraordinary, and that's where I first heard of Pickwick. When I was a child, I was about 10 or 11, I read Little Women. I thought, what is this Pickwick Club? And I was turned on to Pickwick Papers, and that led to the job I'm in today. So.
And the modern day Pickwick Club is sort of formed in that Pickwickian spirit of not taking life too seriously. And nowadays, more than ever, you absolutely need a club like that. When we meet, it's irreverent, it's daft, it's funny, and we don't take ourselves too seriously.
Is it based in London?
It's all over, really. I guess the Dickens Pickwick Club are
one that's sort of
so, yeah, I mean, there isn't a sort of a clubhouse, as it were. But the Pickwick Bicycle Club, they will meet twice a year at the New Connaught Rooms, maybe 400 members. Our spiritual home is the George and Vulture, the great city chop house in London, where Charles Dickens used to dine, and he set Mr. Pickwick in residence upstairs. So that's our spiritual home.
And there's another one in London called the City Pickwick Club, and that also meets at the George and Vulture.
Yeah.
The George and Vulture's between Lombard Street and
Just off Cornhill.
Yeah, just off Cornhill.
And Lombard, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so if you go at Cornhill, St Michael's Cornhill, just down the little alley there.
Yeah.
And it's just as it was in
Unchanged,
Dickens' day.
exactly.
Yeah. And of course, Mr. Pickwick, if you didn't know, Mr. Pickwick, after he has to leave his lodgings with Mrs. Bardell, he's out of town for a bit. When he comes back to London, he takes lodgings at the George and Vulture.
So the gals in Little Women formed their own Pickwick Club. Were there lady members of the Pickwick clubs at the time? That seems quite radical, actually.
Yes, no, but women did form their own. So, so the first known women's Pickwick Club was the fictional one in Little Women, but others followed. There was until fairly recently a London ladies' Pickwick Club, but sadly all the members aged and retired and decided to fold. So,
Victoria didn't perhaps form one of her friends and
not that I know of, but I'll keep an eye out for that. Yes, sir.
Do the Pickwick Cycle Club members have to have a penny farthing?
Well, you say that their big lunch at the Connaught Rooms. One of the highlights is a chap in his straw boater and his striped club waistcoat will ride a penny farthing right up the middle of the hall of part of the lunch. Yeah.
But yes, the penny farthings were obviously quite popular when the club formed in 1870, and its members still enjoy historic bicycles. Once a year on Founders' Day, which is a Sunday toward the end of June, they will cycle from where they first formed in Hackney, the hotel it's housing now. They cycle to the museum at Doughty Street with quite a number of penny farthings and other historic bikes to have their photographs taken. It is a spectacle. So it's around about the 20th this year, 20th of June, if you're walking by at about midday on the Sunday. Any final questions? I think we need to wrap it up now, Tom. Yes. So, Claire, I don't know if you wanted to take the floor.
So firstly, I'd just like to thank Cindy so much for excellent exploration of Dickens's Clerkenwell, and also Ian for his really vivid renditions of extracts. Sorry, from the novels. So yes, thank you both so much. And thank you to all of you for coming today. This is, as I say, the first in this current programme's partnerships with the London Archives. And thanks again to Tom and his colleagues for their work. Our next one will be The Life and Times of Joseph Grimaldi, the King of Clowns, which is being given by contemporary clown Matty Faint. He's going to be exploring the turbulent life of the Regency clown Joseph Grimaldi, who lived and worked in Clerkenwell, as I'm sure you know. So that's Thursday the 13th of February at the same time. And then we also have a wonderful event, Clerkenwell Through Maps, where we're going to be talking about finding out how maps can tell us a lot more than we might imagine. So you can come and discover that looking at London Archives' own Clerkenwell maps. It's an interactive workshop, and that's on Wednesday, the 26th of February, 1 to 4. If you are local, meaning you're from Clerkenwell and you don't already have, from Islington, and you don't already have one of these books, do please pick one up before you leave, and do come to some of our other events. We really look forward to welcoming you. And to all of you, before you leave, firstly, people online, thank you very much as well for joining us, wherever you are. And for the rest of you, we will be serving, once I can get into the kitchen, some biscuits, some nice chocolate biscuits and other biscuits, and tea and coffee, if you just give us 10 minutes to make it. In the meantime, if you wouldn't mind filling in an evaluation form for us, that would be really helpful, because that helps us to get funding to put on this kind of event. So thank you again.
Marvellous. Thank you so much. That was terrific.
Very good.
Guys, still
That's fun.
Yeah.
Hello.